Hey everybody, Quantum back here again, and in today's video we're going to be taking a look at another meta-competitive option that you could be using for the April Store Set Championships. Linked in the description is some gameplay with this version of the deck, and it is an Amethyst Steel combination. Now, this ink pairing actually has quite a few different ways that you could play it. You can play a control-heavy top-end version, you can play a Floodborn version focused on Blue Fairy to draw cards, you can play a very heavy aggro version that Zach Bevins actually used to top 4 in AK, which ironically enough is also a budget version, and you can play a more mid-range version. The version that I'm going to be outlining for you today, and the one that I have linked in the description showing you some gameplay, is actually a combination of an aggro and a mid-range version. The hardest match for this deck, in my opinion, is going to be Steel Song, because they have the songs, just like you do with Steel, in order to remove some of your aggro threats, and it can make it hard to consistently maintain a developed board. Where this deck could really excel is into control heavy metas where you're facing up, let's say, against Ruby Sapphire, Ruby Amethyst, and Sapphire Steel to a certain extent. This deck also, because it is focused a little bit on mid-range and, with some aggro components, should do well into Emerald decks also. Things like Emerald Amethyst, which is very popular, other aggro-based decks like Amber Amethyst, because you have that steel-oriented removal, and some nice surprises which we'll go into that's differentiating it from the aggro-focused version. So there's a lot to cover here, but let's just jump straight in and I'll do my best to try to explain it to you. So to start things off, we're going to start with the 3 Chernobog followers, the 4 Maleficent's Biding Her Times, and the, I guess you can call it, update to what Zach Bevins used in his Amethyst Steel in 4 Robin Hoods. So it should be pretty clear with the Robin Hoods, the 1-drop that we're playing here, that we're also playing the top-end Shift Robin Hood. And this is not budget-friendly by any means, because this is literally the most expensive legendary in Into the Inklands, but it is the most expensive for a reason. So what does this 1-drop package do? You have 11 characters here, and they all kind of serve a unique purpose, but they're all not that bad to play either as a 1-drop early on in the game or even later on in the game, and that's why this package works really well. So the Robin Hoods we already know. You drop this on turn 1 or turn 2. For the turn 3 Shift Robin Hood, you're in business. You've got a big body on board that's pressuring removal with lore gain and card draw when it's banished in a challenge. So it's a good control card, but also good for aggro because it turns your 1 questing Robin Hood into a 2 quester. Yes, you do lose this character because you shift on top of it, but what you gain in doing so is just way too valuable, because from a board control perspective, you're able to shut down a lot of the early game from other decks while continuing to progress your lore gain and your own board state. The Maleficent is kind of in the same boat. This card, in my opinion, is a little bit trickier to know how to play and when to play it. While it does represent a 2 lore quest, which is also very strong, it's not something that you just want to throw out and leave exerted where it gets outed right away and you think, okay, well, I got my lore off of it, that's good enough. If you really want to transcend and be kind of the better player, you need to know how to utilize this card into advantage. And there's a number of different ways you can do that with how you build this deck. We'll go over some of those options, but one of our other 1-drops is Befuddle, are these Mim cards obviously, and even onto the 3 curve, we're running Bodyguards. So we'll cover that a little bit later. But this is a card that you really want to try to get multiple uses out of, whether that being protecting it with a Bodyguard, removing the opponent's threat with the steel cards, or in this case, Amethyst cards like Befuddle, or bouncing it back to hand so that you recast it and it's readied up. While you do play Amethyst, which means you do have access to a lot of card draw, that doesn't necessarily mean you want to waste resources. You need to play intelligently in order to utilize this card to the best of your ability, and you don't want to be playing this card out when it's threatened to be removed. Let's say if you think your opponent's going to Teeth and Ambitions, drop a Tinkerbell, use any kind of Steel Song to remove it. It could be some instances where you want to bait that out and use this as bait, but this card is very valuable because even in the late game, dropping this down, having it readied up, forcing your opponent to say, if I don't remove this, they're going to go for 2 lore in the late game, that could usually be a game-ending play. Finally, Chernobog's Followers, also a good card early or late game. In the early game, this does represent, let me just quest for free. If my opponent has a board setup where they threaten to out my card, I just banish it and I replace itself. Yes, it's a little bit of loss of tempo, but at least I get a card draw out of it. In the late game, same thing. You drop this and you don't really, I don't want to say you don't care, but it represents 1 lore and a card draw. Similar to what Cusco does in Ruby Amethyst, this card at a 1-drop also kind of does the same thing. And it's a 2-1 body, which means it can trade up sometimes with that 2 strength. I already covered what Befuddle can do in this deck. In the early game, it is probably the most impactful. If you see it late game, you most likely just ink it. But sometimes, you know, when your opponent is dropping those weenies on board and they're threatening to go for game, befuddling back one of those threats could actually be a game-winning play. But I'm only playing 2 copies of this. You could argue that you want to play more. But one of the strongest interactions with Befuddle is when your opponent is playing Amethyst and they have a turn 2 Snake. Whether you're on the play or on the draw, when they play a 1-drop and then bounce it back with Snake, this is their only developed card on board. Therefore, if you end up befuddling this back to hand, guess what? They have no board. Whatever you've developed on board, let's say turn 1 you drop the Maleficent, and then turn 2 you're able to befuddle and then drop a Robin Hood, you're now able to quest freely and you have a Robin Hood that threatens a shift on the turn 3. Because your turn 1 was Maleficent, your turn 2 was Robin Hood and befuddled, and your opponent's board is absolutely clear. With Amethyst being such a popular ink pairing these days, with Ruby Amethyst and Emerald Amethyst being the standout colors, you can see how this interaction could be very beneficial. So that does it for our 1-drops. There's a total of 13 1-cost cards, 11 characters, and the 2 actions. I was running 3 befuddles, but I cut one for one of my tech options that I'll go over for you when we get to it. On the 2-drop slot, and one of the reasons why Amethyst Steel is in a very good position, is you are able to run literally the 2 most powerful 2-drops in the game, I think. You could argue that Ursula Deceiver is also up there for its ability to rip songs and see the hand, but you are playing the Mim Snakes and the Smees at 4 copies each, which means you have 8 total 2-cost 3/3 bodies, of which the Mr. Smee is able to quest for 2. This is super relevant and very powerful because it helps you develop very strong characters early on that pressure a lot of lore, forcing your opponent to throw things into it and trade for removal. And they basically have to with the Smee because it's questing for 2. In an aggro deck, when you develop turn 1, turn 2, 2 questers, guess what? Your opponent's going to be like, I need to shut that down. Otherwise, they're going to run away with the game. But you also have the offensive pressure of saying, I can also throw this into any threats my opponent has, and I'll likely be able to trade up because these cards are overstated for their cost. The Mim cards, as we know from Rise of the Floodborn, also trade positively, or not trade, but synergize positively with the Merlin cards, which we do play. So the bounce factor for these cards also can be a big plus, not a detriment when used correctly. Moving on to the 3-drop slot, we are of course playing the standard for Madam Mim Fox. This card continues to be one of the best Amethyst cards in the game. I've been saying that since day one. The fact that it's only 3 cost and is a 4/3 body even of itself is busted. It has rush, which means you drop this, you're able to out your opponent's threats. And again, being able to utilize it in certain situations where you're able to bounce back cards that you want to protect and then use this to out an opponent's threat just gives you so much value when used correctly that this pairing can be extremely devastating to your opponent. One of the things and one of the reasons why I decided to make this deck a little bit more mid-range focused, and to be fair, what you've seen so far has nothing to do with the mid-range. This is, well, except for maybe the Robin Hoods for the shift potential, but this is basically all straight up aggro so far. But you need to still maintain board control to a certain degree, because if your opponent is on a more mid-range or top-end heavy build, guess what? They're going to be outing your board while you are getting ahead in the lore. And again, you've seen this multiple times if you've seen any kind of gameplay interaction, but you can't just rely on, well, you out my threat, let me just drop another one and try to quest for game. Against a good player, that's not going to always work as intended. And the main reason for that is because they'll be outing your threats, which means you'll have less board presence, while they likely maintain characters on their board. So while you can probably drop something and say, yeah, I'll quest for 1 or 2 next turn, they're going to have 3 or 4 characters that say, well, I've been outing your board and I've gone wide on my own board, therefore I'll be going for 6 or 7 lore while you're just going for 1 or 2. And they'll catch up very quickly and just dominate you because they'll have the developed board that you won't be able to out. So you have to play a bit of a board control game as well, which is why the mid-range factor of this deck, or adapting it to be a little bit more mid-range, can be beneficial. Now don't get me wrong, going straight aggro isn't necessarily a bad strategy either, but we've seen instances where that can fall down and not be as effective. Moving on to additional 3-drops, Maleficent always seems like a safe option. At worst, it's ink. At best, it's a card that you can drop that pressures 1 lore. Is easily outable, but if your opponent has to waste resources or tempo in order to out this card, it's not necessarily the worst. And it is a 3 cost, which means it can sing Friends and other steel songs that are relevant in this deck. You are going to see that we are quite top, I don't want to say top heavy, but I guess you can say 3-drop heavy, because we're kind of at the midpoint of the deck in terms of the cost of the cards that we play. Next up, we're playing the Bodyguard packages. This is a very interesting concept with this deck that I think works fairly well. So you have Hercules here and you have the Prince, and each of these serve very unique functions for the deck. Hercules is very good into Amethyst matchups like Ruby Amethyst and Emerald Amethyst, for the simple fact that being a 3/3 body means that it trades with Mim Fox. Remember, Fox is a tempo loss card. Unless you use it really to your advantage to bounce back, let's say, a Cursed Merfolk or a Maleficent biding her time, you're likely losing some board presence, or you are losing some board presence in order to play this. So having this trade out completely means that you've cleared your board, and the Bodyguard should be protecting something very valuable, let's say like a Smee or another 2-quester like Maleficent biding her time. So them having to be forced to out the Hercules and then lose their character benefits you because it helps develop or maintain your board, not really develop anything, but that protection that the Hercules offers you is great. The Prince is not so good into Amethyst for that exact reason, because the Fox runs this over and you basically get no value. The Fox will live, this card gets outed, and yes, it does protect your board, but you get no additional value. So in those matchups, you might consider inking the Prince. Not always, but it is a consideration. However, into other steel matchups like Amber Steel Song, where, like I said, this deck could struggle, and Sapphire Steel, and even Emerald Steel, the Prince represents tremendous value because it's much harder to out on the lower end of the curve and with the Steel Songs that those decks play. And so the Prince represents much more protection in those matchups. Hercules is still good, but the Prince really shines in those particular steel, I guess you can call them mirror matches to a certain extent. Now, I was testing out smashes in this build. The card seems to be decent. I don't want to say it's like an amazing tech option or anything, but because there are some very prevalent 3-strength characters running around in the format right now, think of Ursula Deceiver, Minnie Mouse Stylish Surfer making their way back into the Ruby Amethyst decks, and you're seeing people actually start to shift a little bit into some of these evasive, I guess just aggressive aggro decks, and Smash can do a lot to really slow those kind of decks down. Again, very good against being an anti-aggro card, and it can also just help, I don't want to say finish off stuff, but when you're working against like big bodies, you know, dealing a total of 7 into something, assuming it doesn't have resist, can also help you out some big threats. Speaking of which, one of the better options, and you might even consider playing 4 of them, is Strength of a Raging Fire. Given that you are playing some tempo-oriented cards that cause you to lose some board presence like the Mim Snake and the Mim Fox, sometimes strength can be a little underwhelming, but there are definitely times where this card can help you clutch out wins where you are in games you have like no business winning. In my gameplay video, I outlined a match where I played Ruby Amethyst and we went very far into the late game. I think it was like turn 13. They had like 12 ink. They developed an Ursula Power Hungry. I'm like, wow, who still plays that? That's crazy. Which is the 2/8 character, for those of you that don't know. It has 8 toughness, and against steel, it is an extremely hard card to out. It's almost impossible, right? The card was teched into Ruby Amethyst decks to specifically combat Amethyst Steel and any other steel decks that Ruby Amethyst would face up against, because steel has such a hard time removing it. Well, being an aggro-based deck, guess what? You're able to still go wide. And what I was able to do in that match to win it is put, I think, 5 characters on board total, sing strength, deal 5 damage to the Ursula, and then use a shift Robin Hood in order to take it out, right? Gaining 2 lore in the process, I think, because attacking into the Ursula and being able to banish it with the Robin Hood, only taking 2 damage on the Robin Hood itself, but banishing the Ursula gained me 2 lore. So this card is definitely one of your high value removal options for the mid and late game. And Smash is very good in the early and mid game as well, and sometimes in the late game, but for the most part into the early game for Smash. This card is not a song though, so it cannot be sung, which means you do have to spend your ink in order to cast this, which means this is a card that's reactive. You're reacting to what your opponent is doing to remove a threat, but it's not necessarily the worst. So again, consider this. It's not the greatest, but it does its job for the big threats that you want to out, and it helps you maintain that board control so you can continue to quest as well. It's a good card to play, again, when you're trying to protect something, right? Like if you have an exerted Smee, an exerted Maleficent, your opponent develops a threat finally on turn 3 or 4. Let's say if you're going up against Ruby Sapphire and they finally put something on board that can challenge your threats, you drop this, out it, and you're continuing to quest with whatever you've developed from the turns before. Now, in the aggro versions, you definitely don't want to be losing, what's, I guess you can call it lore tempo, where you're sacrificing questing because you're singing songs instead. So you don't get the lore because instead of questing, you sing a song. But in this mid-range version, and again, if you watch my videos, you would have seen this in the gameplay, we do maintain a very healthy hand most of the time. Amethyst Steel is very good at drawing cards, and this deck is no exception to that. You're able to draw off Maleficent, you're able to draw off Friends, you're able to draw off Rabbit and the Bounce of Rabbit, and you're just able to consistently keep a pretty sizable hand. But the problem is, can you convert that into lore? And the further the game goes on, you would think the more you would struggle in order to do that, considering your opponent, if they're playing better top end cards, they're developing a bigger board than you, and you're just going to have no way to out it. The Sorcerer's Spellbook is the one card that I opted to tech in place of the third Befuddle, and the reason for this is exactly what I said. Once you kind of get to that mid to end game and you're looking for those ways to close the game out, the Spellbook, given how much card draw you have, you'll likely see this hopefully, can really help you do that, because in the early and mid game, you're likely always going to be progressing ahead of your opponent in the lore count, because you're developing a good quest board while you're removing some of their threats in the early and mid game with some of those steel songs and steel actions that we just reviewed. And then to be able to close out the game with something like Spellbook and Goats is very powerful. So this game, you have to really foresee how you're going to close the game out in order to do it, because you got to know, do I need to ink this Goat, or do I need to keep it for the end game? If you're kind of at the midpoint of the game and you're wondering what you need to ink, you need to think, well, in 2 or 3 turns, maybe I start to try to close the game out with Goat. I need to dig for a bounce card or something along those lines. I don't want to lose, risk losing my, third Goat, let's say, because I've inked the other 2 earlier on in the game. So it does require some thought process in order to make sure you're making the right decisions. The Rabbit continues to be a tremendously valuable card. You drop this, it replaces itself instantly. When it leaves the field, it draws you another card. So it's a +1 at worst. Yes, it costs 4, it is uninkable, but it's a body. So when it hits the board, you can likely quest with it. Again, we know how powerful bouncing this is, because every time you bounce it and replay it, it represents another draw 2. So on the initial play, it's draw 2, right? Because when it plays and leaves, and then when you bounce it and you replay it and it leaves play, it's another draw 2. So again, if you've watched my matches with this deck, you've seen me cycle this card to draw an insane amount of cards, and it is very powerful to keep your hand nice and fresh so that you should have an option for whatever the opponent is doing. We're coming up to the end of the profile here, but like I mentioned before, the Robin Hood is the only non-budget friendly card, I think, in the deck, but man, is it ever worth playing, because this is basically another 3-drop for you when you shift. But even in the late game, if you have to hard cast this, just having this on board is very significant. The 3/6 stat line is incredibly beneficial. Yes, it does get Medusa'd, but especially in the early game, being able to take out your opponent's, let's say in an aggro mirror match, take out your opponent's threats while it survives, and it's gaining you lore whenever you banish another character, and then when it gets banished, it draws you a card. It's just like an insanely valuable card in this deck. Being a 5 cost as well, it allows you to sing the final card we're going to look at in this deck profile in the Grab Your Swords. So the reason I've opted to play Grab Your Swords in this build is because, again, if the opponent goes wide, I just want to have a way to be able to deal with a wider board, and I think Grab Your Swords still represents tremendous value, because being able to take 2 damage onto everything, or put 2 damage onto everything, will allow you to continue to crash some of your cards into your opponent's threats and clear their boards out. And again, if you watch my gameplay video, you've seen me do exactly that. This card can definitely help you stabilize. And if people think you're on aggro, they may not think you're running this, and it can be a nice surprise when they try to overextend and they end up getting their board wiped from an aggro deck because you play Grab Your Swords. Anyways, guys, that's going to go ahead and wrap up this video. Let me know what you think if you made it this far. A like would be appreciated. Thank you again for watching. Quantum is out.